Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Friday Night Housing Live. Thank you for joining us. Very popular topic, and we're glad to have you with us and our all-star panelists. My name is Michael Lane. I'm Spurs San Jose Director, and today's digital discourse has been generously sponsored by our friends and colleagues at Lighthouse Public Affairs. So I'll now hand it over to Alice Kessler, a partner at the firm, to introduce the program in today's panel. Thanks again for being with us. Alice?
Great, thank you, Michael. On behalf of Lighthouse Public Affairs, I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's event. As a public affairs firm, Lighthouse grew up in the Bay Area, where we still maintain 4 offices, and Spur has certainly been among our most valued partners. Lighthouse's most recent venture has been opening a state capitol office, where we've had the tremendous opportunity to work alongside the 3 legislators joining tonight's panel, and we're proud to support this important conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in to this digital discourse today. Spur is a nonprofit, member-supported organization that promotes good planning and good government through research, education, and advocacy. Many of you here today are members, so thank you for your support. If you are not a member, I encourage you to join to support Spur's ongoing work in making our cities and region more prosperous, sustainable, and equitable places to live. You can find more information online at spur.org/join. The next digital discourse is scheduled for Tuesday, July 21st at 12:30 p.m. It is Treating Housing as Essential Infrastructure. Housing is a critical piece of the Bay Area's infrastructure and essential to the health and well-being of residents. Yet when the economy falters, the region stops producing the essential housing that we all need. What steps can policymakers take to build housing, both market rate and affordable, during a downturn? How can building housing during these times stimulate the economy, drive down the cost of construction, and create more affordable region for everyone? Today's digital discourse is, what is California doing about housing? The California State Legislature was set to debate hundreds of housing bills before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. In the weeks since, the state budget situation has radically shifted, but the housing shortage, as well as widespread housing insecurity, still underlies many of the challenges faced by Californians. Fortunately, the Bay Area's state legislators remain stalwart housing champions, so join them for a conversation about what they think can be accomplished in Sacramento this year. And we're very pleased to co-present the panel with the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. Our speakers today are Senator Scott Wiener. Senator Wiener represents San Francisco and Northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. Elected in 2016, Senator Wiener focuses extensively on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. We also have Assemblymember David Chiu. As chair of the Housing and Community Development Committee, Assemblymember Chiu has authored laws to increase affordable and supportive housing, incentivize streamlining of housing production, hold cities accountable to build, foster transit-oriented development around BART stations, create the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority to address the regional housing crisis, and establish the strongest state tenant protections in the country. And Senator Nancy Skinner. Senator Skinner represents District 9, comprising much of the Inner East Bay, from San Leandro to Hercules. A social justice advocate, energy and climate change trailblazer, and an accomplished legislator, Senator Skinner completed 3 terms in the State Assembly before being elected to the Senate in 2016, where she serves on 8 committees and is chair of the Public Safety Committee and the Public Safety Budget Committee. And finally, Todd David will serve as our moderator today. He is the executive director of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition and has been active in San Francisco politics throughout his professional career. Prior to joining SF-HAC, Todd was the political director for Scott Wiener's successful Senate campaign. If you have any questions during the program, please don't hesitate to submit them via the Q&A, typically found at the bottom of your screen. Michael will be back later to facilitate the Q&A. And lastly, before Todd begins the conversation, we're going to give each of our guests the opportunity to briefly talk about any particular housing legislation that they want to highlight. Why don't we start with Assemblymember Chiu and then go to Senator Wiener, and we can finish up with Senator Skinner.
Right, thank you, Alice. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to admit that when I was invited to do this 5 o'clock on a Friday session, I was wondering how many folks were actually going to participate. But at some levels, it is a little too early to start binging on Netflix. And at another level, I think this is a reflection of just how much continued interest there is in the most intense crises that we are facing as a region when it comes to housing and homelessness and the plight facing evictions, et cetera. Really want to thank, SF Hack and Spur and all the leaders that have been part of those organizations and really trying to drive creative and innovative and out-of-the-box solutions in addressing homelessness. I'm also delighted to be joined by my Bay Area housing compadres. Senator Wiener, Senator Skinner, and I are part of our informal housing caucus. And I don't think it's an accident that you have Bay Area legislators driving a lot of the bigger discussions around housing, given that we all cut our teeth in the local crises that we've experienced in San Francisco and the East Bay and around the Bay Area, really before other parts of the state. I think what I'll just highlight at this moment is just mention kind of three main topics that I see us tackling, that we've been tackling for the last couple of months, but certainly in the final 5 weeks of session in this crazy time period that we have legislatively. After the demise of SB 50, I think a lot of folks were wondering what the legislature was going to do around the P of production. And I think it's fair to say that while we all share a lot of disappointment that significant SB 50 conversation didn't continue, the legislature certainly has continued to be busy around production, but rather than focusing on one major bill, I think it's fair to say there are at least 15 or so bills, both in the Senate and the Assembly, moving forward when it comes to production. And I suspect we'll talk more about them, but both the Senate and the Assembly, we have housing production packages with some good overlaps, but also just a lot of different topics we're covering. I'll mention a bill that I have in the package, AB 3040, tries to move forward incentives to cities to get them to consider upzoning single-family homes to fourplexes, and there are other ideas sort of in that space. So production is one major category of activity. A second major category is around homelessness. On the Assembly side, we've got at least a half a dozen bills that are tackling different elements of the homeless challenge. And I'll mention one bill that I'm moving forward, AB 3269, would move forward requirements of cities and counties and state agencies to do a gaps and needs analysis of what our current resources being spent on homelessness and what is the gap between the need and what we need to actually end homelessness. The bill also would then require cities to have a plan, to end homelessness, or at least bring down 90% of homeless numbers within 7 years. And then it provides a new state position of an inspector general that would require cities to be accountable to those plans and allow the inspector general to literally force cities through the courts to address homelessness in the way that we currently do when it comes to other elements of housing. The third topic I'll just mention, which is just a big one that's looming, has to do with the fact, and you've probably been seeing dozens of national news articles about this, the likely massive wave of evictions that could occur once temporary eviction moratoriums as put into place by our governor and other governors around the country and our court system are lifted. It's estimated that there are literally several million tenants who at this moment have lost significant income and likely have not been able to pay some portion of rent in the last couple of months and potentially into future months, such that if Gavin Newsom were to lift the temporary eviction moratorium, we could see hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tenants who would owe back rent immediately and could be evicted for that. And so there actually, there's a major Senate bill, and I'm authoring the major Assembly bill to address this from a couple of different directions. I have the bill that the statewide tenant community is supporting to basically say that if the eviction moratorium is lifted, tenants should not be immediately evicted for non-payment of rent, and that we should give tenants a period of time to be able to pay back landlords. There is a Senate bill that's moving forward, SB 1410, that has proposed property tax incentives to landlords to help pay for mortgages and rents. And my hope is that our bill and the Senate bill will become a package in how we address the potential for eviction moratoriums moving forward. So just sketching out some of the big picture topics. This one, I'll turn it back over to Alice and Todd. Look forward to the conversation.
Senator Weiner, do you want to?
Sure. Great. Thank you. And thank you as always to Spur for bringing us all together. And we have an all-star cast here with Todd with SF Hack, does an amazing job. And then Lighthouse is really a fantastic advocate in the Capitol for pro-housing organizations. And I'm honored to be here with my two amazing colleagues, my own Assemblymember David Chiu and Senator Skinner. Senator Skinner, I normally would say welcome across the bay, but of course now we're all sort of, we're all wherever we are. Stepping back, I know there were a lot of people who were, well, some people were cheering in the streets, but others who were disappointed when SB 50 failed by the skin of its teeth on the Senate floor. But I think it's looking at the big picture. First of all, the conversation around SB 50 and its predecessor, SB 827, I think really opened up enormous political space for aggressive pro-housing work. And while SB 50 was doing its multi-year journey, there were other bills that I was authoring, that Nancy was authoring, that others that were able to get across the finish line. And I think SB 50 sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room. And that's not a criticism of the bill. In a way, it was a good thing that it forced people into this conversation. It forced people who hadn't necessarily ever talked about what it meant to be mad about expensive housing and what that meant on a policy level. It forced those conversations in a pretty broad and deep way in California. And so I'm glad we were able to do that. It also provided a lot of cover so that other bills that various of us were authoring were able to get through with less fanfare because so much is focused on SB 50. So even with that failure, not just in the last few years, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years or longer, we've seen a sea change in the state approach to housing, a growing and accelerating acknowledgement, and it's gone beyond, I think when David and Nancy were first doing this in the legislature, it was, the Bay Area where we were like on an island. It has expanded so much that we have more and more housing champions in LA, in Orange County, in San Diego, and the Inland Empire. When SB 50 was being debated, my colleague Connie Leyva from San Bernardino County gave an impassioned speech in favor of it, and that it just shows that we have this disaster that predated COVID has spread everywhere in our state, and that creates enormous opportunity. And I think that's been happening. That California has finally really reevaluated this system of extreme pure local control over housing, which we would never tolerate for education or healthcare or other priorities, and yet we've tolerated it for housing. And people have said, you know what, that's not working. And that as much as we all value local decision-making in so many contexts, including around housing, there have to be enforceable state standards. And that's what we have seen. So whether it is taking older laws that didn't have teeth and putting teeth into them, like Senator Skinner did around the Housing Accountability Act, which has now become a very powerful tool to force cities to honor their own rules, not change the rules in the middle of the game. And Nancy Skinner passed that bill.
It's even gotten housing built in Berkeley.
Yes, exactly. Or the work we've done on streamlining. I'm very proud of the work we did to pass SB 35, which is now, because of SB 35, we have 1,600 units of affordable housing that have been streamlined just in the city of San Francisco. And it's all over the Bay Area and growing in Southern California. And now in Novato, almost 250 units of affordable housing in Novato that are being streamlined under SB 35. So we, been able to increase streamlining, and David did a bill on streamlining supportive housing. So we're seeing just an accelerated pace of approving these projects, and a recognition that 5 or 10 years to approve project is not okay. It doesn't work when we're in this process, in this crisis. We have seen finally more of an embrace of ADUs, to the point where people will say, wait, don't do those big bills, just let us do ADUs. Cities that were fighting ADUs 3 or 4 years ago. And we're seeing an acceleration in the Bay Area and in Southern California of ADUs. And we've, I think, finally, hopefully, closed some of the final loopholes that some cities were using to avoid ADUs. And we are this year, I think, building on that work. And so, for example, we have in our Senate housing package, SB 1120, which is I'm joint authoring along with our lead author, the pro tem of the Senate, Senator Tony Atkins from San Diego, to create statewide duplex zoning. And on top of that, and by right, on top of that, to allow by right lot splits if the lot is big enough, and you can do a duplex on both of the subdivided lots. So essentially, by right fourplex in the vast majority of the state. We have bills in both houses to facilitate converting commercially zoned land to residential, particularly for dying strip malls and other areas that need a new use there. We have legislation that I'm authoring to give cities, because a lot of cities do want to upzone for more density, but because of the CEQA process, it could take them 10 years to do it. So SB 901 will allow, or 902, excuse me, will allow them to upzone up to 10 unit buildings without CEQA, and just to do it as long as it's in a non-sprawl area. And then we are continuing to work to make it easier for people who are building affordable housing, because as much as all developers can struggle when you have these expensive, lengthy, difficult processes, for nonprofit affordable housing builders, that could mean the death of your project. And so we've done, and David has done some good work here to make it more streamlined and easier. And this year we have Senate Bill 899 that I'm authoring to allow churches, other religious nonprofits, and nonprofit colleges to be automatically rezoned and by right build 100% affordable housing on their land. The Turner Center released an analysis that just for churches, there are tens of thousands of potentially available acres in California for affordable housing. So this could be a very, very robust tool. So we're going to get some good work done this year to build on what we've been doing the last few years. And I feel good about where we are and the direction where we're going.
Todd, I don't want to steal your thunder as the moderator. I think you're in charge of the transitions now.
I think Nancy, you're next.
Happy, yeah. So Nancy, tell us what's on your mind and going on in housing in Sacramento in 5 minutes or less.
Well, I'm really happy to be with you all, and of course with my great co-housing partners, Assemblymember Chu and Senator Wiener. And yeah, the issue around the churches, not only will it give us some great housing, but many of these churches are struggling to stay alive. And their ability to develop like this is an incredible community service and also could bring them some revenue. So I just think that is such a very brilliant bill. The more we can think about how to creatively do infill, the better. All right, so my bills. I've got a bill, and I always goof up my numbers, so hold on a minute. SB 1079, where what I'm trying to get at, it's less a bill about production as much as it's a bill about preservation. And what we saw during the last recession and the foreclosure crisis, is so many Californians were foreclosed on, but primarily low-income Californians and Latino and Black Californians, so that we had incredible drop in ownership, very, very serious drop in home ownership. And for many of us, home ownership is the only real way to build equity, generational equity, so in wealth. So we want to try to, and what happened in that time is that corporations, not just small LLCs, huge corporations bought up those homes, and Wall Street has a new whole asset class, which is the corporate-owned single-family home rental. And that ownership changed the whole name of the game in terms of the experience of the tenant to that owner, where things that classically the landlord would take care of for, be responsible for the tenant was all of a sudden put on the tenant, including, high prices and such. So it was really it had many, many repercussions in addition to the drop in home ownership. So given the drop in the economy from the pandemic induced downturn, and given how many people could potentially be foreclosed right now, fortunately, due to David's work, due to many people's works, we've got some protections on foreclosure, but it's not clear that we'll be able to retain those forever. So what my bill does is if a home is foreclosed, then it limits that ability for corporations to come in and just sweep up and buy them. It gives a first ability for a nonprofit housing developer or the tenant occupant or the owner occupant who's losing the home, or a local government to try to bid on it and purchase it back. It also gives, if there's corporation buy-up of a lot of homes and they abandon them and wait until the economy goes up, but just leave them in a blighted condition, it allows for local governments a little higher, if they choose to be able to do a higher fine. And there's some things like that. So it's really about trying to make sure that we don't experience what we experienced in the last recession. So that's SB 1079. And then I have a bill on density bonus. And look, density bonus, when California passed it, was conceptually an incredibly important tool in order to give us more infill housing and especially affordable units. And with the assumption that the market rate developer would be willing to dedicate X number of units to permanently affordable if they are able to put more units into their footprint. And so that was the whole concept of the density bonus. But when we look at over time, its use, and the Turner Center has written some great reports on this, it has not been used. Very few jurisdictions anywhere in the state have approved any development utilizing the density bonus. And those that have, which is it's like 39% or something, jurisdictions that have only approved 1 or 2 projects. That's it. So it has not fulfilled its promise. And some of there's various reasons. The Turner Center has a really good outline for why. And so what my bill is doing is trying to make that tool be so that we get affordable housing from it. And I raise the amount of VLI, very low income, that a developer would have to meet in order, if they got to the density bonus. But I also make it compatible with the Housing Accountability Act. And I address what's in the Bay Area, a very, very real need, and it's in a few other parts of the state, which is that middle income that many of the workers that all of us depend on and that we need and want to live in our community cannot afford Bay Area prices. And so the density bonus right now does not work for them. And we don't want our most lowest income subsidies to go to the quote unquote missing middle. And yet we have to have some ability for them to have housing too. So I've tried to address that, and it's we have the chair of the committee here, but I know that I'll be making some modifications to it in our interactions with Assemblymember Chu's committee, narrowing. I mean, the issue that a lot of affordable housing advocates are afraid of is that if you create the possibility for the density bonus to be used for other than most low income, then in a way you're not going to achieve the very affordable housing that we need. And I certainly appreciate that. But when we look at how much real low income housing we've actually achieved with the density bonus, it kind of belies. It's like it's one thing for us to to, not want to change a tool because we don't want it to, but it's another thing to change a tool to actually result in housing for people. So what I am very open to is narrowing where that missing middle piece could apply so that it's in a very, narrow set of circumstances. And of course, lifting the VLI requirement. And there's a couple of other things like that in the bill, but I think it's a very necessary bill. And the other thing, there is a bill that Assemblymember Gonzalez has on the question of density bonus, which I'm a very strong supporter of. And I'm very interested in making sure that our two bills are complementary and not at odds. And so we're trying to work that out also.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean,
Sure.
Certainly San Francisco is one of the jurisdictions that we do see state density bonus being used. And so your bill is one that we are very supportive of and focused on. I think that it will help strengthen and get more housing built. So thank you so much for being the author of that bill. And welcome. I'm very excited to be able to moderate the original Housing Dream Team of Scott, David, and Nancy. As Scott mentioned, the team's getting larger, right? We're adding more people.
We welcome.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting. And for those who do not know, I think it is worth mentioning that, Senator Wiener is the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate, and Assemblymember Chu is the chair of the Housing Committee in the Assembly. So San Francisco and the Bay Area is well represented. What I wanted to start with, I was going to ask Scott and David if they could speak to a little bit about the housing packages in each one of their houses. And then I was going to ask Nancy, what do you think is missing from the packages? So can we start there? Scott?
Sure. I don't have the list right in front of me, so hopefully I won't mess it
Fair
up.
enough. Yeah.
There are a few bills, and I'm definitely going to mess up some of the numbers. So Nancy, you can correct me if I mess it up.
I never remember numbers.
Yeah. I believe it is 6 bills in the package. One of them I mentioned, SB 1120, which is the duplex and lot split bill, a very good bill. 2 of them are the bills I'm authoring. SB 902, the allowing cities to go up to 10-unit buildings to rezone without having to go through CEQA, as long as it's not sprawl. And SB 899, which is the church and nonprofit college affordable housing bill. Then we have, I believe it's the 1085 by Senator Caballero, which is the Senate's commercial rezoning bill. So that these strip malls, et cetera, can be converted to housing. And then Senator Skinner's density bonus bill that was mentioned. And then we also have another bill by Senator Caballero, which is the Senate leadership's tenant protection measure. David alluded to this. It is a bill, and I'm a co-author of SB 1436, David's tenant or anti-eviction bill. But the Senate leadership's approach is to basically, it's a voluntary program for landlords, but it allows landlords, if they participate, they have to waive the tenant's back rent entirely, and then they will get that equivalent amount in state tax credits over a 10-year period. And they can either exercise them over 10 years, or what we think is likely to happen is there will be a market where they can sell them at a discount up front. So they'll get whatever, 70 or 80% of the value. So they won't get everything, but it's better than having tenants that aren't able to pay, and then you have to deal with litigation or just having the tenants leave. And then the tenants will then owe the money back to the state, and will have to repay it over a 10-year period starting in 2024. So it's really over more like a 13-year period. And if they're low income, they're eligible for a waiver of that amount. There are some mechanical aspects of the bill that definitely need to be worked out, which I commented on when I voted for the bill on the floor, the Senate. But it's just a different approach that I think can be complementary to the protections in David's bill. I hope I'm not forgetting any of our bills, and I'm sorry I don't have a list in front of me, and I don't want
So
to
Scott,
insult any of my colleagues.
yeah, so 902, 995, Caballero's bill is 1385.
Okay, and 995, I did forget one. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah,
995, SB 995 is a bill that extends. We have something called AB 900, which was an old bill number, but it basically accelerates sequel lawsuits that the court has to decide it within, I think, 6 or 9 months. And typically, AB 900 has been applied to like stadiums and arenas, and people always say, hey, why not housing? So SB 990, and it can apply to housing right now if it's $100 million project or more. SB 995 will take that down to, I think it's 10 or 15 million. So smaller housing projects will be able to get this accelerated treatment for sequel litigation, so you're not stuck in court for years.
And we have two pretty significant housing developments in San Francisco right now that are utilizing AB 900. The Crescent Heights production at 10 South Van Ness and Prado Groups on California Street. So, and it's been great. So it's great to see that bill move forward. Thank you. David?
So while Scott was talking, I was able to grab a list of all.
Unfair advantage, David.
Going a second. So we have a number of bills, and I'll just quickly lay out. So Laura Friedman, who's the chair of our Natural Resources Committee, has introduced two bills to basically clarify CEQA. And it's a big deal that the chair of the Natural Resources Committee is doing this. So AB 2323 and 3279 are basically both meant to help make info projects to clarify exemptions from CEQA and to really make that process less painful when it comes to info projects. Nancy Skinner referred to our Assembly 2345 bill that Lorena Gonzalez is authoring, which is really trying to use and enhance state density bonus laws to be able to basically provide additional concessions and more increases in density that lead to more affordable units. So that's exciting. Buffy Wicks, Nancy's, actually she's your Assemblywoman, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So she has two bills. One is a complement to Senator Wiener's bill around churches, around reducing parking requirements on church sites. And then she has another bill, AB 725, to require more sites in every city to be zoned for multifamily housing. My colleague Richard Bloom, who has been a long champion in our housing caucus world from LA, the former mayor of Santa Monica, he has two bills. One is AB 3107, which would make housing permissible in commercial areas as long as it has a certain level of affordability. It's a complement to a Senate bill that Ana Caballero is doing.
Right.
And then his AB 1279, which would essentially upzone and by right housing in affluent areas, which is a theme I think many of us have been talking about for quite some time. And then I previously mentioned my own AB 3040 bill, which provides incentives for cities to upzone single-family zoning to essentially fourplexes. So what we say is you get a very real and hard RHNA credit. If you do that, it's not theoretical. So this is the way to basically tell cities as they're trying to meet the much increased RHNA numbers into the next cycle. This is a way for cities to lock down some of their RHNA obligations. So that's the package. And then because the Senate had included what I think of as sort of in the landlord-tenant space, we are now obviously talking about our AB 1436 as part of our Assembly world. We've got about a dozen of our Assembly co-authors on this. And I mentioned it before. Scott had talked about the property tax incentives on the Senate side to help pay for rents and landlords. Our bill provides tenant protections. And again, it's my hope that we can figure out how chocolate and peanut butter come together with the tenant kind of approach and perspective that we're bringing on the Assembly side, with being able to provide additional funding and monetary resources to really help this entire equation. So that's the Assembly side in 3 minutes or 4 minutes.
That's great. So Nancy, I'm just curious, what do you I mean, if you wanted to get into individual bills that you would like to see added, or I was more kind of wondering just like general themes, what do you think is missing from the packages that we need to see in the housing?
And also what she likes about the packages, Todd.
And also, oh, I apologize. Also, Nancy, what do you like about the packages?
Well, look, I think, so, you know, we're, to imagine that our homeless crisis could get any worse, or that our housing crisis, well, right now, our quote unquote housing crisis won't necessarily get worse, other than we might see less production just because of economy. But our homeless crisis could get way worse because people, I mean, it already has. Look, I mean, all of us, I'm sure I have not been to San Francisco since the pandemic. I can't believe it. My birthplace, and I haven't been over there. But, you know, I've hardly left Berkeley except to go to Sacramento. But in Berkeley, we have more homeless. Oakland, we have more homeless. Richmond, we have more homeless. So then everybody, why? Why all of a sudden, why? We know there was eviction moratoriums. There are all these things. Well, think about it. We know already there were many, many, many more people who were housing insecure. And they might have been couch surfing with relatives. They might have been, you know, who knows? And when the pandemic occurred, if you're not part of that immediate, you know, if you're whatever, that family is probably saying, hey, you know, it was lovely to have you here, but right now we're too scared for our health. You can't be here, or whatever it is. And that's part of why we have so many more people in tents now and living on the street than we even did before the pandemic started. Even with whatever, Project Broomkey or you name it, we still have. And then of course the shelters, if you are on the street, you're not going to go in a shelter when you're going to be, you know, whatever, in crowded conditions. So long and short of it is, who could imagine that our homelessness problem could get worse? And yet it can get worse. So we must do everything we can to keep people in their homes. And yet we are in also, our state revenue is dropping. So I think Assemblymember Chu, I agree with you. If we can try to somehow come together on them both, but we know that if the owner of the property has no means of supporting the property, then we can do all the eviction moratoriums we want, but there'll be other things, you know, that just, it's, so we have to have both. We've got to have some ability to support, and I'm not talking about corporate owners, but you know, there's some level of owners that have to have some support, then we're going to have to be of assistance to them at the same time that we are completely protecting those tenants, 100%. So I think that is essential. And then the other thing is that we're talking about both houses in our economic stimulus are trying to talk about how we could get some money on the street right away to help fund housing so that we don't see a drop in production. And there's lots of talk about whether we do a some kind of tax credit things, or whether we do a bond, whatever measures we use. But one of the things that Assemblymember Ting is looking at, that Senator Hertzberg, various of us are very interested in, is ADU financing, because there are many, many homeowners very willing to do an ADU right now. And during the pandemic, they want that ADU for their elderly relative to keep them out of a assisted living or a nursing home where they may be at risk for COVID, you know, so there's lots of motivation, but there's rules around the way mortgages are lent, or rather refis and things like that, that limit the ability of the homeowner to get that capital to add an ADU. So we're looking at trying to figure out how we might help finance ADUs, which would be hugely helpful. So those are some of the things I think that we have to make sure to put all in the mix.
If I could just add, I just want to add, in terms of the Senate and Assembly tenant bills, I think they are complementary, or certainly can be. You know, the Senate bill, it's voluntary for landlords. They can take that path and get their income tax credits and waive the back rent, and it can be an elegant solution. But the challenge with it, or the limitation of it, is the landlord may choose not to do it. And so if they choose not to go that route, then we need to have rules in place that protect against mass evictions, and that's what David's bill does. So I'm sure there would have to be some dovetailing between the two, but they strike me as complementary.
I'll just say
So-
we're actually having that very conversation right now between
Yeah.
us and how to resolve this. I'm going to add two quick things. So Nancy referred to homelessness, and I mentioned on the Assembly side, we've got a half a dozen bills that our good senators will be reviewing sort of in that space around streamlining what happens around homelessness, consolidating and centralizing, and then frankly requiring jurisdictions to do the hard work of assessing what the resources are, planning, and really tackling homelessness. And then I will mention one big topic that I wish we were moving on, and this really is as a compliment to Scott's work, but part of what SB 50 was about was a conversation around transit-oriented development. And a couple years ago, with the support of my great colleagues, we moved forward our BART TOD bill, which, for folks who have been following, there were East Bay elected officials who said the world was going to end at the idea that BART should be able to develop 10 acres of land that it owns around BART stations. And it's turned out that the process has actually worked quite well, and BART is working well with local jurisdictions to do it. I had hoped that one of the things that was going to move forward this year was some replacement around TOD, and I know there's many of these bills sort of touch on this, but I do think that's a topic we should move at some point. I'm looking forward to Scott moving it.
Yes, and Assembly Member Chu, that BART bill was a brilliant bill. So kudos.
Well, thank you. And I'll just remind everyone that it got out of the Assembly with 42 votes, and I need 41. So it got out by the skin of our teeth, and both Nancy and Scott were instrumental in helping it move through the Senate. So
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. And I
That
think
was like a goat derby, that fight on the Senate floor. I've never really seen anything quite like it before.
and I got a Republican member. I'll protect his to vote for it for whatever. But anyway, yes, we succeeded.
So kind of sticking with the political theme of, I think, David, you have famously said in San Francisco politics is like a knife fight in a phone booth, and Sacramento politics is a little bit like playing 3D chess. I feel like I might have heard that perhaps the knife fight and phone booths are kind of starting to occur in Sacramento around some things.
They're more secretive knife fights in both.
Yeah, they're more secret knife fights. But I do think that I can't remember, David, if you were mentioning Laura Friedman's CEQA streamlining bill, but it does seem like there seems to be some contention with the building trades on kind of some of the housing bills. And I just was wondering if you all would be willing to kind of talk about what that dynamic is like.
I don't know why you would say that, Todd.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I feel like I heard it somewhere. I'm not sure where. And
Yeah,
so, Scott, do you want to speak to it?
yeah. So if you're in San Francisco and you're looking at your Facebook or your web browser, you might see my face up there in some ads. So the state building trades, who I've long considered a partner for many, many, many years on housing and transit and infrastructure, and I've worked very, very closely with the trades for many years. And want to make sure that we're creating middle-class jobs for construction workers. The state building trades have taken, I think, a more aggressive position on some housing bills this year, and they're entitled to do that. And especially as we go into a recession, there's going to be probably less work for a few years, and so I get it. And it's against the backdrop of there's a big statewide on again, off again negotiation about what we call the residential wage for wood frame, low to mid rise housing, which if that deal can be cut between the building industry and the building trades, that would open up the door to a lot of collaboration and a lot of union jobs. So the state building trades are opposing a number of bills in both houses. David had some contentious bills in the Assembly Housing Committee. We had some contentious bills in the Senate Housing Committee. For whatever reason, they've now chosen SB 899, our church and nonprofit housing bill, as a bill that they are now intensely opposing because they want a sea change in state law, and we're trying to work through it and see what we can do. And so there are some ads with my face on it running about that, which is fine. It's just politics. They're opposing, there's a bill by Senator Portantino that they're opposing from the Senate. They are, I'm not sure what else, but there has to be a bigger conversation about this. This isn't just about one bill. This is about how do we have labor protections and labor protections that work, where we can still build the housing and we can have good wages and benefits for construction workers. And that's a needle to thread, and it's very threadable. We've threaded it before, and so I'm confident we'll come up with a solution, because this is all family. It's all the building industry, the building trades. This is all about people who want to build housing.
David or Nancy, anything else additional you'd like to say about that?
No, well said. Well said, Scott.
Okay, very good. I have a laundry list of questions I would love to go through with you, but unfortunately we are running a little bit short of time. And so I am going to now turn the program back over to Michael Lane from Spur, and Michael is going to take some questions from the audience. It was great talking with all of you. Thank you so much for all of your great work. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you all. And thank you to our audience for submitting some questions. I'll try to run through these fairly briefly so that we can catch as many as possible. And those who on our panelists who would like to answer will allow you to do so in a relatively brief format. Some of these topics have already been covered in some degree, but if you wanted to add additional detail, feel free to do that. Is it possible to develop an economic recovery stimulus bond that could, among other investments, provide billions of dollars for below market rate housing? What is the chance of seeing something like that on the ballot?
The answer is yes, we can and we should. I think it's a little bit touch and go at the moment, and especially as we get towards the point where the Secretary of State has to print ballot handbooks, et cetera. But it is possible. There's still some time, but it's touch and go at the moment.
Is the legislature providing sufficient funds for cities to end homelessness in 7 years? Even in good economic times, cities that devote a lot of resources to homelessness, like San Francisco, saw growing homelessness. How can cities accomplish this?
I'll take that. I think the answer that we all know is absolutely not. We just don't have enough resources. When it comes to homelessness, I think there are two things that are true. We could very likely be doing a better job with the resources we are currently spending on the one hand, but on the other hand, the problem is so big that we very likely don't have the resources to tackle it. But one of the things that I think everyone knows is we don't exactly know what that delta looks like, which is why, as I mentioned before, my bill that would require every city to do that analysis. What's the size of your homeless problem? How much resources do you need to get there? What resources are you spending so that we can actually put numbers and data to that question? There's never any question. In San Francisco, we know, 20 years ago, we had 7,000 homeless folks. Now we've got that, if not more. 20 years ago, we were spending, $100 million a year. Now we're spending $400 million and growing. So we've got to figure out, get our arms around the magnitude of the problem, what it would cost to efficiently and humanely a roof over everyone's head, and then figure out what the funding is going to look like for that. And I think we do have to have a revenue conversation. One thing I'll just throw out, if you're talking about revenue bonds, I completely agree with Scott. I wish we could be moving forward on that. We still could in the future, in part because interest rates are so low. I push the idea of ending the mortgage interest deduction for vacation homes, which is an income stream of about $250 million a year, but it could be bonded. If they were bonded, it would be a $4 billion upfront ability to invest in housing that's affordable and for homeless folks, and something I think we should bring in the near future.
Well, I just quickly add to that, And yes, more money needed. What that amount is, it's too hard to estimate. I mean, it's very difficult to know, but we're never going to address it if we don't really we have to have so many more units of housing in the state. And every bit of obstacle, every time we get into these fights around different legitimate interest groups who feel like if we lift X obstacle or Y obstacle, that somehow that hurts them. Those obstacles are what are keeping us from being able to build housing. And we got to lift them, and we got to build a lot more housing.
Okay, thanks. Here's a hot topic. Do you think public transit will recover to support TOD? And as more people work from home, how will those dynamics change in terms of housing development?
Yes, it will. It's if we are there for it, and I think that, and there are two parts of that. There's the triage we have to be doing now, so these systems don't shut down, and that's where the greatest risk is. That we just let these systems flounder and do long-term damage. So to me, that's where the greatest risk is. In terms of the future, I think there are a lot of hot takes about what the permanent state of the world is going to be post-COVID-19. And keeping in mind that we're like 6 months into this pandemic, really 4 months when you look at the intensity in this country, and everyone has a prediction. No more offices. Everyone's going to work from home. No one's going to want to ever go to a baseball game again. Public transit is dead, forever. And I'm sorry. First of all, there is no way for us to make that prediction. We also know that we have had some terrible pandemics before. And when the 1918 flu pandemic hit, which was just an absolutely extreme and destructive pandemic, COVID-19 has nothing on that influenza. The world returned afterwards, and people were together, and people went back on transit, and people went back into group settings. And so we're going to get past COVID-19 one way or the other. And I think people will return to transit. And I also think that the demonization of transit is, I think we have to push back against. That, it is, the risk is when you are around other people. And that doesn't matter if you're at a birthday party, or you're at church, or you're at the Costco, or you are on a subway. And so there's going to be risk there. There's nothing like unique about transit. And the initial studies they've done, including around the New York subway, show that there is not a real correlation. In fact, the lowest infection rates of the 5 boroughs in New York City was in Manhattan, which has the highest density of housing and off the charts transit use. And then you look at the Asian countries that have, so yes, of course, we're gonna, have to do some things differently, but we have to stop the demonization. And most importantly, we have to support these systems so that they don't get killed off before we can get past COVID.
I'm going to just jump in for a second here and not only agree with Scott, and listen, at some point the pandemic will end. That is sort of how, if it doesn't, we're all really screwed. So one, we should believe it, but two, history will bear that out. And unless we all want to continue to live in our homes and never interact again, we've got to bring it back. Now, how we do it, that's the trick. And what we know before coronavirus is 27 different transit agencies not working together, not integrated. It's probably not the right equation. Right now, what we're seeing is all of these agencies are struggling to survive on their own. And I think many of us think that these agencies need to work in a much more seamless and integrated and regional way together. Certainly, I'll just mention that what's happened this week with Caltrain, it's an amazing, I'm trying to think what the right word is. It's incredibly unfortunate that happened. It's understandable that a number of local jurisdictions went back into their corners, but what we really need right now is for everyone to realize for the long term, we are a region, and for a region to survive and thrive, we got to work together. So my hope is as the Phoenix rises out of the ashes, we figure out how to not think of ourselves as 101 cities and 9 counties, but think of ourselves more as a region, both when it comes to transportation and how it comes for housing.
Great. And one final question regarding local officials' complaints about how these bills impair local control. Do you consider them genuine or primarily to placate local voters and other groups?
Well, I would totally respect local control if local control resulted in the housing that we need. It has not. So I want to, I do not want to defy it 100%, but if we have to nibble at its edges in order to get housing, then we have to nibble at its edges.
I'm of the view, this is not just around housing, but local control for the sake of local control is a meaningless argument. It's the same, it's no more meaningful than we have the argument should be federal decision-making or state decision-making. Well, it depends who's in power. If you're in power in Congress, then you want to have federal decision-making. If you're out of power, you want the states to do it. And so it's a meaningless, sort of substance-free argument. And I say this as someone at the same, I have had multiple bills. I'm up at 2 bills now where I'm trying to give more local control. One is to say cities should be able to go later with their nightlight if they want to, empower the cities. And the other is giving cities, I'm working with Assemblymember Susan Eggman on this, giving cities the power to have safe injection sites in their city if they want to, not forcing them, just taking away the state impediment. And there are cities that while they are fighting us to the death on these state bills saying, we love local control, you're taking away local control, also oppose these bills. The city of Los Angeles, I will call them out, the City Council of Los Angeles opposed SB 50 for taking away local control, and then opposed the late night bill for giving them local control. So clearly it's not about local control, it's about we don't want more housing, and we also don't want later nightlife. So people should at least admit what they're actually arguing for, because it's really not about local control.
Great. Well, we've reached the end of our time, and on behalf of SF HAC and Spur, we'd like to express our deep gratitude to Senators Wiener and Skinner. And as Assemblymember Chu, we couldn't ask for any better representatives in Sacramento, and we appreciate all that you're doing so much. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.